I would like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Bloom gave us some good counsel on many things, and maybe you remember that old children's sing-song saying about how we can be healthy, wealthy, and wise. I think we have some good prescriptions there about how we can merge health and wealth, but I think we're as a society, as a world, we're still struggling with the wisdom part of it. I'm reminded of a 1972 film where Robert Redford played a candidate for governor of California named Bill McKay, who was a kind of a dark horse coming out of nowhere, idealistic candidate running against the old Paul, and he won, and then he turned to his aide and said, now what do we do? And I think that the challenge we have, if we do manage to get through and develop a roadmap so that we can address aging and find a way to have an economically healthy, thriving economy, I think all of that is necessary, but in my view, and I suspect in the view of our next speaker, none of it is sufficient at this point, because we don't have a way to deal with the fact that we're not just living off our parents' inheritance, we're now living off an inheritance that took billions of years to create, and we're dissipating it in nanoseconds in Earth time. So I would like to introduce Brian Czech, who is the founding president of the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, visiting professor at Virginia Tech, and he is going to talk about supply shock, economic growth at the crossroads, and the steady state solution. So, Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody. There's one big advantage to running late, 15, 20 minutes late or whatever. Anybody that would have come in at 1:15 or 1:30 expecting to see me, they probably got a better first impression. Now they got to deal with the real me. So this talk is pretty shamelessly titled after my book, which has just come out, and so has this thing, but I think we're good. Before I pull the slides up, I do have an extensive slideshow that goes with the talk, and I'll want to have to breeze through it. But I think the main points I want to make is that for there to be a viable population stabilization politics, there's a prerequisite of a paradigm shift. That is a paradigm shift away from economic growth as a goal to the steady state economy as a goal of nations and as a standard in international diplomacy. And you might say, why? Why is that necessary for there to be a very viable or successful population stabilization politics? Well, there are at least three reasons. For one thing, in conventional economics, conventional economic growth theory in particular, you do need increasing population for economic growth in the long run, and we're going to get to some of that. Some of it's really shocking, actually, the implications of conventional growth theory. That's one thing. So as long as the overriding domestic policy goal is economic growth, then forget about population growth, because you need that for economic growth. Or forget about population stabilization. Another thing is that population is even more taboo of a topic socially and even religiously than that very secular thing called economic growth. I noticed that population connection used to be called ZPG, zero population growth. At CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, that's at least one thing we have going for us. We don't need to rename that economy connection. It's not quite that off the charts to be advocating a steady state economy. even though at some point, I think as you alluded to in the intro, that will entail stabilized population. But it's sort of like putting the horse before the cart. So I think that's enough. I think I've made the point that to really have a viable population stabilization politics, you have to first undergo this paradigm shift away from growth to the ideal of a steady state economy. And then the next main point I want to make, that in order to precipitate that paradigm shift, or for that shift to occur, there has to be widespread public awareness of the trade-off of the conflict between economic growth and many other desirable things, goals. You know, the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, and economic sustainability, and national security and international stability. So it's a process of connecting the dots from economic growth to a large number of problems that are getting worse at the margin. And then third main point that I want to make is, in order to raise that awareness of that conflict and those conflicts, we really need a new an ecological macroeconomics. And that's what supply shock is all about. And so I'm going to bring the slides up, I hope. Uh-oh. I'm not sure this is the right one, but I guess we'll find out. I know the title slide is right. Slideshow. Okay, so there it is, and among the outstanding speakers before and after me, many of which are accomplished authors, I have the one advantage of this one being hottest off the press, it having just come out a month ago. And I brought a whole suitcase of the things across from Arlington, so at the break I'm going to be signing those and selling the thing at my cost, author cost, because this is not really a money-making endeavor on my part. I really want to get the word out about the contents of this book, which I spent much of the last 14 years of my life writing. And so here's what we're going to go through in Supply Shock, these 4 parts: economic growth at the crossroads, and then a bit about history, the dismal science comes unhitched, and then an overview of ecological economics in part 3, and then part 4 on politics and policy. So this first part, this is the part that I probably breeze through the fastest for our purposes. But chapter 1, being titled, It Really Is the Economy, Stupid. This is all about connecting the dots. When we think about the many, many problems, especially environmental problems, but then all the things that are linked to environmental problems, we should reflect a bit on things like this. Hopefully everybody knows what that is. Pivot agriculture, in this case in Kansas, above the Oglala Aquifer, the most rapidly declining aquifer in the United States, and a severe supply shock in the making. Another pivot agriculture landscape, this one in, of all places, Saudi Arabia. And on and around the world we go, with aquifers being depleted for purposes of agricultural production. There it is on the ground, and probably worse yet, irrigating Roundup-ready soybeans, an extremely unstable ecosystem for its simplicity. And then on through the economic sectors we go now to the real base, the energy sector, in this case pulling out all the stops for tar sands in Alberta. Timber sector, clear cuts, up close and from above, livestock production, overgraze. My profession, by the way, my day job, I'm not an economist. I teach ecological economics, I teach steady state economics, but my day job is as an interdisciplinary biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are the scenarios that I'm really intimately familiar with after most of my decades spent on that stuff. And then we're skipping now up through the through all the manufacturing and heavier service sectors to the so-called information economy that patches all these things together to go even faster and further. Connected by the prerequisite infrastructure, transportation and power and water, and of course all powered by the energy sector, and then don't forget the other end of the tailpipe, the byproducts of all this economic activity. So this suggests that we're in what the fellow most known for steady state economics, Herman Daly, has called the full world economy. Or you might say it's been a process of good growing gone bad. You know, I don't think anybody argues that economic growth was always and everywhere a bad thing. Even people like myself readily acknowledge it was a phenomenally wonderful thing for the past couple hundred years for most of people in the Western world, and it still is a very important thing over much of the world. But we also have to remind ourselves when we talk about whether or not, or how big of a problem economic growth is becoming, we have to make sure we're on board with that, everybody is on the same page about what it really is. So let's just remind ourselves of the basic textbook, policy relevant and publicly resonant definition of economic growth. It's nothing more than increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. That's a key phrase. And it's expressed in terms of gross domestic product or GDP. And so it makes it clear that it entails increasing population and or per capita production and consumption of goods and services. Again, that's a key phrase, in the aggregate. You know, I mentioned my day job is with the government, and there, I would like us in the government, especially in the conservation agencies, to be able to raise that awareness of the trade-off between economic growth and, well, in our case, biodiversity conservation especially, but environmental protection in more general terms, and then all the other things that stem from that. But you really can't talk about it. And I'm not exaggerating that. It's a very serious situation of culling of a particular controversial issue out of the bureaucratic and political dialogue in civil service. So that's why people like myself, we have to put on different hats. If you notice, the day job isn't even mentioned in the program. I'm only mentioning it here because there aren't any bureaucrats or political appointees here that are too close for comfort, for my purposes at this point in time. But so let us at least look at the gorilla, the 800-pound gorilla. We'll bring it out of the corner here, and now let's watch it grow. So that's economic growth, right? That's not economic growth. That's why that phrase, in the aggregate, is so important. Someone for sure will argue with you that, oh, no, what do you mean? We can have economic growth. We can have more and more of a solar panel sector while we're reducing fossil fuel consumption, and therefore we're reconciling economic growth with environmental protection. No, that's not it. That would be maybe some type of sectoral readjustment. But economic growth is a macroeconomic phenomenon. It's increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. That's why it's measured by GDP. And the gorilla is also a good metaphor for purposes of recognizing the two arms, population and per capita production and consumption. So there's economic growth. And of course, it's pursued at highest levels in government. It's a social ideal as well as a political one here at the Fed headquarters in D.C. and Wall Street at the New York Stock Exchange, of course. And so now part 2 is a bit about history of the dismal science coming unhitched. And I will really skip the dismal part because we've had enough dismality at the thing already, I think. But, you know, Malthusian theory and discussion is well known among this crowd, and maybe folks also recognize John Stuart Mill and recall that he was a fellow who was an early proponent of a steady state economy. He called it the stationary state. So there were precedents in classical economics for recognizing limits to growth and the need to move towards stability in terms of the size of the economy. I would like to maybe focus a little more on this part of the history of economic thought. That is the evolution of neoclassical economics. Anybody recognize these folks? Probably the economists in the crowd do, but Henry George and John Bates Clark, mortal enemies. And our focus here is sort of a side effect of that affects that paradigm that I say needs shifting, that I think is required to shift for there to be a viable population stabilization movement. See, Henry George wrote Progress and Poverty, published in 1879, and this was an extremely influential book, especially in North America and other English-speaking parts of the world. By some accounts, selling more books than any other title than the Bible until 1911. Now, I don't know what overcame it at that point, but this is, I write about this in the book. I found documentation to that effect. In any event, he was the heart of the populist movement of the latter part of the 19th century. And Progress and Poverty, if you're not familiar with that, you could say what the Communist Manifesto was to the capitalist, Progress and Poverty was to the land baron. Imagine that. And he's writing in the United States. He starts out in the West, he moves to the East, and he proposes to socialize land, essentially. He wants no income taxes. I mean, no taxes on wages. And he wants no capital taxes, but he wants a full tax of the Ricardian rents. So there's no unwarranted advantage in owning land. Naturally, it pits him against, what you think, you know, the Rockefellers and people who then become very, very influential in academia, and including in the establishment of economics departments, and for that matter, entire universities like the University of Chicago. Meanwhile, the tax code is in its most formative stages. And so for our purposes, you know, I don't want to go into the whole bloody theory of the corruption of economics. There's a historian by the name of Mason Gaffney that already did that from the University of California at Riverside, economic historian. All I want to note is that better than any other thing, I think, this helps understand how that myopic production function got into your introductory business and micro and macro textbooks. If you took econ course, you were taught production is a function of capital and labor. Well, it's fine because it is a function of that, but my gosh, if you studied economic history and history of thought, you must have wondered, well, what the H happened to land? Remember, because in classical econ, that's what it was all about: land, labor, and capital. No land there. And it, you know, it may seem like a minor point, but it's talk about a paradigmatic problem. And that is why we have modern theories of economic growth that are so problematic, because they're all drawn from this landless production function, beginning with the solo model in 1956 and leading to today's state-of-the-art endogenous growth theory. You know, there's solo, and skipping forward a few decades with Paul Romer. By the way, I want to say I've read the theories and a lot of the surrounding literature, and it's brilliant stuff. It really is. It's beautiful, elegant. But not in all respects. It does have a fatal flaw if we're thinking in terms of sustainability. So Romer, by the way, to help tie in with some of the other talks so far, the main thing Romer did is he endogenized the process of technological progress. In other words, he worked it into his growth model. The way he did that is, well, here's the problem. He took that landless production function and he concentrated on the L for labor. And basically he said, well, there's regular old labor, and then there's this portion of labor that's devoted to technological progress. It's devoted to research and development, or R&D, which is the thing that gives us technological progress, raising the bar for further growth, and not only that, but further growth per capita. In other words, with increasing returns to scale as the network of mines expands out there. That's exactly how we got these embarrassing, from an ecological standpoint, notions of perpetual economic growth on a finite planet. You know, probably some of you recall Julian Simon, and it may be viewed as a very simplistic notion, the idea that as the economy and the human population grows and environmental problems arise, that, well, there's more and more brains, and so we solve those problems one by one, and therefore there really is no problem with population growth. Remember that? People thought how idiotic that was, but it really was writ into the calculus of endogenous growth theory. Same general conclusion. You actually need population growth, not just for GDP growth, but for increasing GDP per capita. Astounding stuff if you're an ecologist. But that's state-of-the-art in growth theory. And then politicians love that kind of stuff. Remember Jack Kemp, God bless him, but boy, I'll never forget during the, I think it was about 99 or so, in the run-up to or in 2000, he was campaigning for vice president, and my gosh, he said, he got all red, and his hair was all white, and he said, we should double the rate of growth, and we should double the size of the American economy. Now just remember chapter 1, it really is the economy, stupid. All these problems that growth is causing, and he wanted to double the rate of the growth and double the size of it, just, you know, in an administration. So this brings us to the ecological economics that we need in this day and age. And you know, if we would like to attribute the beginnings of this in a modern sense to some folks, certainly at the top of the list would be Herman Daly, whose work in steady state economics, both in and out of the World Bank, and then at the University of Maryland, was key. And one of his colleagues of sorts, loosely speaking, Dana Meadows, one of the lead author of The Limits to Growth. Remember, well, Herman in particular came up with this iconic diagram, and by now a lot of us have added all kinds of bells and whistles to it, but this really provides the alternative to that landless production function. This is our basic ecological macroeconomics vision or paradigm. It's a circular flow of money, the economy there, sure, but it's within a planet. And so it makes it so easy to see how as that economy grows, well, it encounters those planetary limits. Well, what I've done in Supply Shock is focused on a couple of things that even in dailyist steady state economics and so on escaped attention. And they would escape attention without a little more ecological nuance. And what I'd like to talk about is this. And when I first started thinking about this, I think was in the early 90s. I wasn't into this stuff yet per se. I was a wildlife biologist, and then I was working for the San Carlos Apache tribe in Arizona, and I was the director of their game and fish department. And the San Carlos Apache tribe, one thing about them, they have the 4th largest reservation in the U.S., and it's a very distinguished reservation in terms of wildlife ecology. For example, just one example, the biggest elk in the world come from the San Carlos Apache Reservation. Well, we would sell hundreds of tags to tribal members for very little amount of money. You know, it was their bread and butter, so to speak. But the tribe would designate 3 permits for maximizing income for the tribe. And the money was earmarked for elk habitat improvement. The last year I was there, we sold 3 of these tags for $43,000 a piece. That's right, $43,000 a piece, because hunters would come from all over the world to try to kill the biggest elk ever killed and recorded. It's a strange society out there if you're not at all familiar with the trophy hunting outfit. It's really something. But it got me to thinking, because, you know, some people might have said, oh, here's an example how we can reconcile growing the tribal economy with environmental protection, growing the economy in general with environmental protection. Problem is, 2 of those tags that year were bought by the owner of the largest old-growth sawmill in the Pacific Northwest. See, that's how the money gets generated. That's a key word. That word generated gets abused too much in talk about, you know, economic and ecological sustainability. You hear about ecotourism in Costa Rica generating income for the country. Nah, it's not generating anything. Somebody at the base of the economy had to produce, just like the classical economists would have told you, in order to free the hands for the division of labor to spend the money on things like elk hunting and flying around in helicopters in Costa Rica. And, you know, and it helps with ecology to harken back to your basic concept of trophic levels. You know, you've got the producers at the foundation of the economy of nature. It's the same thing in the human economy. That's the foundation. And then the human economy itself, with the rest of the species, you could call that the human inclusive economy of nature, and recognizing that relationship makes it very easy to see why you have a burgeoning list of threatened and endangered species, and the list of causes of species endangerment is a who's who of the American economy, because it's the human economy exerting this trophic compression, basically squeezing out the other species. And what is overlooked, though, in economics, absolutely, in conventional, even ecological economics so far, but we're getting there. I just came from the annual conference in Burlington, Vermont. We're getting there. And the trophic theory of money is what I call it in Supply Shock, which is that the amount of real money out there, as well as major macroeconomic indicators like GDP, you know what? Those are basically sound, very sound indicators of ecological footprint. And it also helps us to understand then just why there's a limit to growth, not only in the real sector, but in the real monetary sector that does flow in concert with the real sector. And yet we have this crazily fallacious notion in neoclassical economics that as the economy grows, yeah, it causes problems, but then when we generate enough income, we will solve those problems. Well, it was lacking the trophic concepts to recognize that the generation of income is what was causing the problems to begin with. So there's another really key thing about technological progress. So some would say, well, couldn't we overcome that conflict through more and more technological progress? Because after all, that's how we get more efficient, more output per unit input, right? So maybe we can get around it that way. But that's, you know, that's akin to what we've already been talking about, and it's what has led folks like Solo to say the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources. Another guy that won a Julian Simon Award some years back said, natural resources originate from the mind, not from the ground, and therefore are not depletable. It's funny, but gee, you know, the shocking part is these are serious people with way more influence over economic affairs than most of us that laugh at how crazy that is. You know, if you have a background in physics, you recognize well, there's no free lunch. That's the first law of thermodynamics, and with the lunch that you do get, you can't eat it perfectly efficiently. That's the second. You know, with all due respect, John, you know, they're certainly getting more and more efficient. You talked about the wild card before, but closing the loop completely is precluded by the second law. There must be waste in the transformation process from factors of production to consumer goods and services. There will be co-product or byproduct as well. But nevertheless, you can get more efficient with R&D within some limits. And so R&D is looked to as at least a temporary, or thought that it could be. Some people think it could be a temporary reconciliation. But you know what we usually fail to look at is where's that R&D itself coming from? Well, it comes from profits. Today it's very heavily institutionalized. Problem with that is, you know, profits dry up. Economists of all ilks for hundreds of years now have recognized that. It's basic econ. They dry up, except for who? Those firms that somehow maintain a competitive advantage. And how do they do that? Well, we're back to R&D again. So we have a problem. We have kind of a catch-22 here, right? Or if you will, a chicken-egg spiral. You know, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Doesn't matter too much. If you want more chickens, you need more eggs. If you want more eggs, you need more chickens. And there's one way out of this, though. There's one way you can get more eggs and more chickens and more R&D and more profits. But you never hear it talked about. I looked for it for years, literally, because I couldn't break this catch-22 until I finally studied Rostow's tome on the history of economic thought and ran into the accounting business of Edward Denison. And I think the answer is economies of scale. You see, that's your one other way to increase efficiency than technological progress, except you don't do it except based on current levels of technology. So you were not able to reconcile the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. If you ever heard of Jevons paradox, this is basically this de-paradoxizes the macroeconomic version of Jevons paradox. There's an example of economies of scale, same level of technology, but that big boy there is way more efficient in terms of units per capita, or output per unit energy, but it certainly is concurrent, or in fact concomitant with a way bigger ecological footprint. So that's why, you know, this talk about green growth is nonsense. And, you know, economies of scale, it operates in the information economy and also at the end of the tailpipe with things like the BP spill. Here you see approaching New Orleans. Well, now we get to the final part, which is about the politics and policy. And metaphor that I've started to use a lot is the horse and the cart. This chapter 9 is kind of a history about economic growth, politics, and I would like to skip that part for our purposes. But I'll talk a little bit about this part, and then more so, I think, the next part. Hummer haters. Anybody remember seeing that little thing on ABC Nightly or NBC Nightly News? Well, I'm almost out of time. They're going to hate me if I don't hum it out of here. So I wrote about this steady state revolution in my first book, Shoveling Fuel. And basically it's about following the model that was developed in the anti-smoking campaign in the 70s. I remember this. I was a kid going through the hallways in school seeing these posters. It was the social construction of the smoker to be a dummy, slob. And you saw the smoking behavior has continued to decline with some bumps in the road, but going down. And because it hits at the powerful motivational forces in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, no lower than the self-esteem level. Well, it's the same idea with conspicuous consumption, just like smoking. It's, by definition, conspicuous. The Hummer driving, the McMansion building, the Furco, they both impact public health. They can be socially constructed. So that was the idea. You develop an attitude, tap into Maslow's hierarchy, and as Keynes would say, the propensity to consume declines. So you go toward a steady state from the demand side. How about one more minute? And sometimes people say, Czech, come on, just get to the policy. Stop talking about all this psychological stuff. But I disagree. You got to put the horse before the cart. Are those things going to work? I don't think so. The policies are in the cart. The paradigm's the horse. You got to put the horse before the cart. So when you get there, then you can, sure, we do have a policy framework for steady state econ. It starts with explicating the steady state economy as a goal. And then it's easy. You go to the policy tables where fiscal and monetary levers and buttons are currently being set, and you gradually set those back toward a steady state. And then you have, of course, various aspects, including the incentives, the direct regulations, the economic incentives and the tax codes and so forth for population stabilization, which will be much more viable with steady statesmanship, which also finally would probably be to best effect at this point in history in international diplomacy. And there's precedent for this already in international diplomacy. Looking at GDP per capita is an obvious place to start, especially with our trophic theory of money. We know that GDP per capita is like ecological footprint per capita. The UN is, one of the venues for this, and using the ecological footprint, which is contributed to both based on population and on per capita consumption. So nobody's innocent here, but on the other hand, there are some obvious features that when you start backtracking the ecological footprint, if you will. And then the idea is that you take the wealthiest and you have a block of, I call for a G100 in supply shock to commence the steady statesmanship. And what the outcome of this is a trickle down of the propensity to consume, which has the concurrent effect of rising above the lowest poverty line. And, the goal is for an outcome like this, so that these problems are solved diplomatically instead of via war. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have a coffee break. Let's go with a couple of questions. We have one right here. Yes? Question or comment?
Okay. So you talk about one of the goals being educating the public about the importance of shifting to a steady state economy. And it's one thing to talk to folks who are employed, educated, who are well off, but I'm curious about how you go about talking about slowing economic growth and ultimately stabilizing economic growth to a part of the population that has a much lower income, that is not employed or less educated or even below the poverty line. So how does then steady state economy relate, and I guess population stabilization, relate to income inequality and going forward with closing that income inequality gap?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two basic answers to that. The first answer is you wouldn't necessarily go there first. You would start in places like this, where we have time to sit here and confer and dissect. But we don't forget about the people you're talking about either. They're certainly part of the polity. They vote. And when you got a politician out there saying we should double the size, you know, that's going to hurt their own grandkids as much as the unwitting politician that wants to double the size of the economy. So there's their vote. There's also their social behavior, and that's what this, you know, the social construction of the smoker. It didn't just come from rich, rich folks. It came from across the board in terms of income classes, at least. And same thing with conspicuous consumption. Consumption is not synonymous with wealth. There are some prerequisites for conspicuous consumption in terms of wealth or debt, but you know there can certainly be productive behavior in terms of affecting society's propensity to consume, conducted at all levels of income.
Let's take another question or comment if we have one, and see if there's anybody else who didn't get a chance. It was like there's one. I don't know if there was a question there. Okay. If not, we have one right up front here somewhere. There you go. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I appreciate your presentation. My question is usually now in playing politics. And you don't know exactly how the people believe the false misleading statement by some special interest group. And then the real reality is we want to discuss sort of like more academically or by the merits of the studies, research. The problem now is study or research or public hearings are misleading or they can be manipulated and erase the public hearing or change the public hearing statements. So I just want to, even by the R&D, and there something has some merits, but some are really misleading. And according to our budget or public policy, they usually misleading and give the subsidy to corporation or to some special interest group by whether it is by the oil or gas or economic development or by the school construction. So even the money go to education, that doesn't benefit the student or teachers, but the money was siphoned to benefit a few. So I just wonder, how are we going to have a public be aware of all this mess, and we have a very promising growth because people are really should be able to be productive to do something for economic growth. So I just wonder if you can really make it really encourage people to stand up and make your statement heard and make the people's voice heard. That is a way to work. Otherwise, the whole
I'm with you, ma'am. The only way to get there from here is with a lot of effort, and that's why our organization, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, we're not a think tank. We publish stuff, you know, this is our latest book, but we have, for example, a position on economic growth, and I'm going to have it back there, in fact. It's 16 sentences, but it makes crystal clear that there's a fundamental conflict between growing the economy and then all these other goals that we have. and it calls for a steady state economy, beginning in the wealthiest countries, while those with widespread poverty do indeed continue to have economic growth. And that is one way to empower both the concepts and the politician that may want to run on something more steady statish. The politician that would practice steady statesmanship is empowered by a growing list of supporters in terms of numbers and also notability. You know, we have top named scientists that have signed the Cassie position on economic growth, many top economists even. Without tremendous amount of, I'll tell you what, foundation funding is real hard to come by in this. Our experience with foundations is they'll come just short, they'll come up to the doorstep, but we're not quite part of their circuit just yet, you know. There's a little more viability in the so-called new economics network, where it's not made that explicit that a steady state economy is the goal. But you know, that's why things like tactics, like a position on growth that doesn't require money per se for any one person to sign it's productive. We brought it to the Council of Economic Advisors one time, and the one in particular on the council that we met with, she said to us, "I'll never forget this conversation." She hadn't even heard of steady state economics. That blew me away, but it was also extremely encouraging. I'll say one more thing about that. One thing we have going for us that the other side, if you will, the perpetual growth side, does not have going for them is a hell of a lot of latent common sense. Not only do we have the sound science, the thermodynamics and the ecology and all that, the sound science, we got common sense galore on our side. So all it takes is a little more effort, and you know, it's not going to be a miracle or anything like that. In fact, if we go with that runaway train metaphor, and a lot of people are convinced that we're on a runaway train and it is going to crash. But there's still some good news there. With all the common sense we have on our side, with all the passengers on that runaway train that can do things at the margin to slow that down. That's wonderful that crash could be at a lesser speed, causing less casualties and leaving more pieces to pick up by posterity to build a brighter future.
All right, well, thank you very much.